I don't remember the last time I cried before that night. I'm not sure if it's because I trained myself not to, or because something inside me had dried up long before any of this. What I know is that when the cell door slammed shut and the sound of the bolt echoed through the damp concrete, I didn't feel fear. I felt something worse. I felt that it was deserved, and that feeling was heavier than any chain they could have put on me. It pressed down from the inside, which is the only direction a weight like that can really come from. If you're watching this right now, I need to ask you something before I go any further. If this testimony touches something inside you, if you feel like you need to hear more stories like this one, please subscribe to this channel and leave a like. It's not about vanity. Every single person who does that helps this story reach someone who might be sitting in a darkness very much like the one I was in. Now let me tell you what happened. My real name is Noor Ibrahim al-Rashidi. My mother named me Noor because she said that when I was born, on a summer afternoon in Deir ez-Zor, the light was coming through the hospital window in a way she had never seen before. She said the whole room seemed to breathe light. That's why my name. That's the Noor who existed before all of this. But for many years, that name ceased to exist. For many years, I was only the judge. I was 23 years old when I joined the Islamic State. I wasn't captured. I wasn't deceived by a boyfriend or lured in by promises of romance. I went out of conviction. That matters to say out loud. It's the hardest part to admit, and it's the part that matters most to understand. Because if you see me as a victim from the beginning, you're going to miss what's true about this story. The truth is harder and stranger than victimhood. The truth is that I chose it, that I walked toward it with my eyes open and my jaw set, and that understanding that fact fully without softening it is the only honest place this story can start from. I grew up in a Syrian middle-class family in Raqqa. My father was a history teacher who kept his books in careful stacks along every wall of his study. My mother sewed wedding dresses for women in our neighborhood, and our front room always smelled of fabric and the warm metal of her iron. We had a small house with a garden where a pomegranate tree grew that I never saw bloom because it was always pruned before the season. I used to stand at the kitchen window looking at that tree and feeling vaguely frustrated by it. I understand it better now. Something that should have flowered, kept from flowering by hands that thought they were helping. I was a strong student, rigorous, methodical, driven. My father used to say I argued like a lawyer from the time I was 10 years old. He said it with pride. More than once he sat across from me at the dinner table and shook his head slowly and said, "Noor, you will run something someday." He meant it as a blessing. I took it as a mandate. Later I understood I was using that gift for things he never could have imagined. The same mind that made him proud is the mind that sentenced people to death. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth about how gifts work. They go in the direction of the convictions that hold them. The war arrived in 2011. Not all at once, but in layers, like an illness you first mistake for tiredness, then fever, then one day you can no longer get out of bed. I was 18 when the first real violence came close enough to feel in my chest before my mind caught up. I remember standing in our kitchen when I heard the explosion near enough to rattle the window glass. The smell of smoke drifted in within minutes, sharp and bitter, mixing with the smell of bread my mother was baking. The two smells together, bread and smoke, warmth and burning, made something in my stomach seize up that didn't fully release for years. I stood there with my hand on the countertop, not knowing whether to scream or pray. I prayed. Back then, I prayed because it was what you did, not because I felt anything on the other end of it. In the 2 years that followed, I watched my country split apart. I watched the government that was supposed to protect us bomb markets and hospitals. I watched groups that promised liberation transform into just another form of cruelty under different flags. I watched my father go silent in deeper and deeper ways, as though he was disappearing from the inside out. He sat at his desk in the evenings surrounded by his history books, and I would stand in the doorway and think, he knows how these things go. He had read about it 100 times. Maybe that's why he stopped talking. Inside me, where there should have been grief, there was rage. A clean, clear rage that needed a direction. The Islamic State gave me a direction. I won't romanticize it. There was nothing beautiful about it, but there was one thing I desperately needed at that moment, a structure that promised meaning, a law that said there were absolute rights and absolute wrongs, with no room for the ambiguity that had swallowed my country whole, a community that said suffering had an identifiable cause and a prescribed solution, a language that named the enemies clearly, separated the world into the saved and the condemned, and gave me a position among the saved that my effort and my intelligence could reinforce. I was young, I was furious, and someone offered me a key that seemed to fit the lock of my despair. So I went. I left my mother crying in the doorway. She grabbed my sleeve and I pulled away. And for a fraction of a second, I felt the fabric pull tight against my arm before it let go. I kept walking without looking back because I knew that if I turned around and saw her face, I couldn't go through with it. My father was somewhere inside the house with his back to me. He didn't come to the door, he didn't say goodbye. That was the last moment I saw the garden with the pomegranate tree. The last time I smelled my mother's iron and her fabric. That was the last moment I was, in any real sense, Noor. In the first months I was trained. Ideology, Islamic jurisprudence as they interpreted it, procedures, codes of conduct, the structure of the organization. I learned fast. I've always learned fast, and they noticed. In an organization that treated women as property in the vast majority of its functions, whose ideological framework insisted on the subordination of women as a divine order, there was nonetheless a niche where my particular capabilities could be put to use: the tribunals for women. Cases involving women accused of violations of Sharia law under their interpretation. Cases that male judges could not or would not conduct directly for reasons of segregation and procedural propriety. There was a need and I filled it. Within 2 years, I was a judge. Within 3 years, I was the only female judge with full autonomous authority in the Raqqa region. I presided over cases, I examined accusations, I weighed testimony, I applied the texts as I had been trained to apply them and as I genuinely believed they demanded to be applied. I rendered sentences. There was no appeal process. There was no defense counsel. There was accusation, evidence, the law as I interpreted it, and there was sentence. I moved from one case to the next the way a person moves through a workday, with purpose, with focus, with the particular exhaustion of sustained concentration and the particular satisfaction of tasks completed. 47 women. That is the number the International Tribunal presented when they went through the documentation. 47 death sentences bearing my signature. I am not going to stand here and tell you I didn't know what I was doing. I knew. I believed every sentence was justified by the law I was applying and the divine order I believed I was serving. I believed with the full force of a mind trained to be certain that I was executing justice. That is what makes it heavier, not lighter. It wasn't ignorance, it wasn't coercion, it was conviction. The most dangerous form of human certainty because it believes itself to be immune to correction. Some of those women were accused of treason, some of adultery, some of listening to forbidden music or uncovering their faces, some of speaking against the governance structure. I remember very few faces with any clarity. What I remember more than faces are hands. I don't know why hands, but when I try to remember those sessions, what comes back most often are hands. Folded in laps, gripping fabric, pressed flat on a table, clasped in front like people do when they're trying to hold something together from the inside. I remember one woman who was perhaps 40 years old, with fingers deeply calloused from years of labor, who held my gaze throughout the entire hearing without looking away once. Not with hatred, not with pleading, with a kind of serene sadness I could not understand at the time, the expression of someone who has already made peace with something you haven't caught up to yet. I sentenced her. She was taken away. I stood, straightened my papers, and walked into the next room. I slept well that night. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment. I slept well. I dreamed. I woke up with the call to dawn prayer, and I rose and I prayed, and I drank my tea, and I went back to work. Conscience can be anesthetized with sufficient ideological conviction. The belief that you are the instrument of divine will is one of the most effective anesthetics ever devised. I was living proof of that. I have had to live with being living proof of that every day since. The collapse didn't come from a sudden moral awakening. I didn't wake up one morning and see my reflection and understand what I was. It came from a much smaller and far more mundane crack, a contradiction in the application of the texts, a small inconsistency in a system that claimed to have no inconsistencies. There was a woman brought before me, accused of having listened to forbidden music. There were witnesses. The accusation was provable. The procedure was straightforward. I adjudicated it. But in that same week, a commander whose conduct I was personally aware of, conduct that under any honest reading of the same jurisprudence I was applying would have constituted serious transgression, was promoted without any proceedings, without any scrutiny, without any of the accountability the system claimed to demand of everyone equally. I raised the issue carefully, precisely, with correct language and proper textual references. I was not emotional about it. I was not rebellious. I framed it as a procedural question in the only language the structure respected. The response I received from someone above me in the hierarchy was delivered without hesitation and without any apparent awareness of its implications. You are not here to question. You are here to execute. That should have passed. I should have absorbed it and moved on, but it didn't pass. It lodged somewhere it couldn't be dislodged from, like a tiny splinter of glass in the pad of a finger that you can't see but that announces itself with every touch. I started noticing things I had successfully not noticed before. The way sentences varied, depending not just on the nature of the violation, but on the relationships around the accused. The way texts were quoted with precision when they served and paraphrased loosely when they didn't. The way the system I believed in was not applying a divine standard that transcended human interest. It was doing exactly what every human power structure does, protecting those with power and consuming those without it, and dressing that function in the language of revelation. That process of seeing took almost 2 years. 2 years during which I continued to work. The fracturing was happening underneath while the surface held. I want to be honest about that. The harm didn't stop while I was having my internal crisis. The workday continued, the files continued, the signatures continued. I don't get to claim my journey interrupted the damage. It didn't. What was changing slowly and without any clear destination was that I was losing the thing that had made all of it bearable, the certainty that I was right. And without that certainty, what remained was just the raw, unmediated reality of 47 human beings whose lives had ended because of a signature I had put on a document. Without the theological scaffolding, that reality was something I had no category for. I had never, in all my adult life, built any interior structure capable of bearing something like that. When the caliphate began to collapse militarily in 2017, 2018, I didn't flee. There were people who fled, corridors and possibilities for those who wanted them. I didn't pursue any of it. I think I already understood on some level I couldn't articulate yet that I didn't deserve to walk away. I'm not calling that wisdom or courage. I'm calling it exhausted surrender. The moment when the armor you've been wearing gets too heavy to carry and you let it fall because you have no strength left. I was captured by Syrian Democratic Forces in 2019 near the Iraqi border. 3 others were with me. No resistance. The moment of capture was almost quiet. I remember the cracked, dry earth against my face, the fine dust in my mouth that tasted of nothing but aridity, the sound of helicopters in the middle distance, the smell of diesel. I remember thinking with complete calmness, this is where it ends. Not as a lament, just as an observation. The most neutral thought I had maybe ever had about myself. I was taken to a detention facility in Al-Hasaka, a concrete cell. The walls were gray and slightly damp to the touch, cold even in the early summer heat outside. A window near the ceiling, not a full window, just a horizontal slot, maybe 30 centimeters tall, that let in a strip of sky the color of old pewter. A thin blanket on the floor that smelled of mildew and something else I couldn't identify, something institutional and faintly chemical, a metal bucket, a single overhead light fixture mounted too high to reach with a bare bulb that flickered when the power fluctuated and went out entirely some nights. And silence between the muffled sounds of the facility beyond the door, a silence that was not peaceful but waited. The silence of consequence, the silence of having arrived somewhere you have been moving toward for a very long time without knowing it. The first 2 days I lay on that blanket and stared at the gray ceiling. I didn't pray. I tried. The muscle memory was there, the posture, the Arabic, the words in the correct sequence, but there was nothing on the other side of it. No sense of transmission, like trying to make a call on a phone that has no signal and no battery, going through the motions of dialing, while some part of you already knows the call isn't going anywhere. I had prayed thousands of times over 6 years, many of them in the hours before I carried out functions that I believed were acts of worship, and now I couldn't make the words carry anything. They fell out of my mouth and dropped to the concrete floor and stayed there. On the morning of the 3rd day, I woke before the light changed in the window strip. The cell was still fully dark. I could smell the cold concrete, that particular sharpness distinct from warmer conditions, almost mineral. I could hear someone coughing far down the hall, and somewhere even further, a radio too faint to understand. I sat up with my back against the wall and did something I had not done since before the ideology. I let myself think about specific people I had sentenced, not the abstract 47, specific ones. The woman with calloused hands, a woman who had been brought in wearing a coat too large for her, clutching the lapels together with both hands as though the coat were the last thing between her and some final exposure. A young woman, I thought at the time perhaps 17, though the paperwork said 19, who had not spoken a single word during her entire hearing, only looked at her own feet, moved only when directed, still otherwise with the stillness of someone who has gone somewhere, inside themselves where the proceedings can't reach. I had sentenced all of them. And now it was just me and the dark cell and their faces, and no ideology left to stand between me and what those sentences meant. Something in my chest cracked open. I pressed the back of my hand against my mouth. I hadn't cried in so long that the sensation was almost unrecognizable. The pressure behind the eyes, something that made me blink. I pressed harder, but nothing stopped it. When it came like something structural giving way, not like weeping, but like a building coming down. My whole body was involved. The cold floor, the rough wall at my back, the dark pressing in. I cried until there was nothing left, and then I sat in the empty that came after, which was somehow louder than the crying had been. I didn't sleep again that day. When the light was fading through the narrow window, when the strip of pewter sky had gone to dark blue and then to black, I was in a state I had no framework for navigating. Not grief in any clean sense, not remorse as a concept I had previously understood, something raw, Something that felt like the moment just before you're sick, when your body has already made its decision and the only question remaining is where and when, not whether. I lay down on the thin blanket. I pulled it over me. The cell was dark. The bulb was off. The window showed nothing. I was fully, completely awake. The kind of awake that has no softness in it, no drift toward sleep, just the sharp and pitiless awareness of exactly where you are and exactly what has brought you there. And that was when the light appeared. I want to tell you this part exactly as it happened, and I want to tell it without any decoration, without any language designed to make it more dramatic or more accessible than the plain fact of it, because the plain fact is strange enough. I had lain down. The cell was dark. I was awake. In the corner nearest the door, the air began to change. I don't have a better description than that. The air changed. A warmth gathered there that wasn't the warmth of a lamp being switched on, which throws shadows, which has a direction, which reveals itself in the way it changes the light on surfaces around it. This had none of those properties. It was more like the air itself in that corner had become luminous, the way water can become luminous with something living inside it from within, rather than from a source, warm, gold white, still, not threatening, not demanding, just present. The way a candle flame is present, small, self-contained, somehow making the darkness around it softer rather than harder. I sat up slowly. I looked at the slot at the bottom of the door. In some cells, there's a gap that lets in light from the corridor. There was nothing. Whatever was in that corner was not a reflection of anything from outside the cell. I looked at the corner and I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. My palms were flat against the cold floor. I was shaking slightly, not from cold. I was completely, precisely aware of everything. The mineral smell of the concrete, the faint texture of the blanket under my hands, the quality of silence in the cell at that moment, which had changed, which had become a different kind of silence. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of presence. And then the voice said my name. Not the judge, not my organizational designation, not at the title that had been my identity for 6 years. It said Noor. Clear and unhurried, the way you say someone's name when you are standing close to them and you have all the time in the world and you simply want them to know you are there. Not urgent, not loud, intimate, the way your name sounds when someone who loves you says it in a quiet room. I need you to understand what that meant. That name had not been spoken to me, not by anyone in any context, in more than 6 years. The last person who had used it was my mother, in the doorway, the moment I left. The people who had known me as Noor were dead or scattered or had long stopped looking for me. That name did not exist in the world I had been inhabiting. No one in that detention facility knew it. I had not spoken it myself, had not thought of myself by it, had not permitted it to exist in any functional sense for the entirety of my time in the organization. It was locked away somewhere so deep and so sealed that I had nearly forgotten it was there at all. The voice said, Noor, and the door to that sealed room blew open. I don't know how long I sat there after. I became aware at some point that my face was wet. I had been crying without registering it, the tears running in 2 streams down my face onto the collar of the thin shirt I was wearing. The light was still there in the corner, not fading, not brightening, not performing anything. Simply present, the way I imagine someone sits beside a bed when they have been waiting a very long time and they are not in any hurry because the waiting is also a form of faithfulness. I said quietly in Arabic, the language of my childhood and my prayers and everything that had been most fundamentally mine before the ideology translated me into something else. Who are you? What came back was not a second voice exactly. It was not thunder. It was not the room filling with sound. It was something I can only describe, even now with inadequate language, a knowing. A warmth that moved through me the way warmth moves into very cold hands. Not dramatic, not sudden, but thorough. And within that warmth, a knowing that said, without words, with the directness of a fact rather than a statement, I am the one who made you. I am the one who gave you your name. I am the one who has been here through all of it. And I have been waiting for you to have nothing left. I stayed awake until morning. I did not move from the corner of the floor where I had ended up sitting, my back against the wall, my knees drawn up, watching the strip of window slowly shift from black to gray as the night ended. The light in the corner faded gradually as the room brightened, not disappearing with any drama, but dissolving gently, the way mist dissolves into the morning. By the time I could hear the facility coming to life, metal doors, footsteps in corridors, a distant voice giving instructions, I was a different person than I had been when the night began. Not a complete person, not a repaired person, not a person who had worked anything out or resolved anything or arrived at any conclusions, but different in some way that felt permanent, like a thing that has been cracked apart and then set not the same shape it was before the break, but solid in the new configuration. I asked the guard who brought my morning food if there was anything to read. He stopped and looked at me like I'd asked something he wasn't sure how to categorize. He left without answering. About 2 hours later, he slid something under the door. A copy of the New Testament in Arabic, worn nearly to dissolution, the spine cracked and reinforced with peeling tape, several pages coming loose. He said, not looking at me directly, "Someone left it. No one wanted it." Then he walked away. I picked it up off the floor. It was lighter than it looked. I sat down on the blanket and I held it for a moment before opening it, feeling the slightly warped texture of the cover, the softness of the pages from being handled many times, the faint smell of something dusty and old and human. I opened it at random, the way you do when you don't know where to start and you're willing to let chance make the first choice. The page I opened to was in the Gospel of Matthew, and the words I read first, the very first sentence my eyes landed on, were these: "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I read that sentence and set the book down on my knee. I looked at the corner of the cell where the light had been, and I said out loud to no one and to whoever might be listening, "I'm weary." I don't think I had ever said that in my adult life. Not to another person, not to myself. Weary was not a condition I had permitted myself. The identity I had built and the organization I had served were both founded on the refusal of weakness, the performance of absolute certainty. I had spent 6 years proving my sufficiency by the standards of that system. I had sentenced 47 women to demonstrate the unflinching application of what I believed. And now I was sitting on a thin blanket in a concrete cell saying out loud, "I'm weary." It was the truest thing I had said in years. I read that book over the following weeks, the way you drink water when you've been in the desert long enough to forget what water feels like. Not gracefully, not slowly, not with the methodical scholarship I had applied to texts in my legal work, just as much as I could absorb, as fast as I could absorb it with a hunger that was almost physical. I read about a man who sat with people the religious establishment had written off, who spoke with women in public when that was considered inappropriate, who touched the people marked as untouchable, who told the powerful that their position was not what they thought it was, and told the powerless that their position was not what they had been told, who was tried without a legitimate proceeding and executed on the basis of a sentence rendered by men who were afraid of what he represented, and who walked out of death on the third day as though death had made its best case and been found unconvincing. Something kept happening as I read. I kept preparing for the fine print, for the section that would say, "except in cases of," except for those who have, except when the blood on your hands has reached a certain threshold. I had spent my adult life inside a system with very precise boundaries, clear lines of who belonged and who was cast out. I kept expecting to find those boundaries in the words of Jesus. They weren't there. The clearer it became that they weren't there, the more I understood it wasn't vagueness and it was intention. He kept specifically going to the ones everyone else had finished with. The lost sheep. The prodigal son, the woman dragged before a crowd of men holding stones. I am not going to tell you I understood it all. I am not going to tell you I felt clean. I am not going to tell you the weight lifted. It didn't. 47 women don't disappear because of a conversion experience. I want to be absolutely clear about that because anything less would be dishonest, and a dishonesty about something that serious would also be an insult to those women's memory. The accounting of those 47 lives belongs to God alone, and I am under no illusions about what standing in that accounting will feel like. What changed was something different and in some ways more radical. I was no longer bearing all of it inside a void. The weight was still there, but the void was gone. Someone had entered the empty space. And that presence didn't minimize what I had done. It invited me to bring all of it into the light rather than spending the rest of my life managing it in the dark. I'm curious about something right now, and I mean this sincerely. Where are you watching this from? What city? What country? Because I think about this sometimes. The fact that someone might be listening to this story in a room on the other side of the world, in a place that feels completely removed from anything I've described, and something in what I'm saying might be touching something real in their life, some form of darkness they're carrying, some name that hasn't been spoken to them in years, some version of weary that they've never allowed themselves to say out loud. If that's you, wherever you are, I want you to know that you're not watching this alone. Tell me where you are in the comments. I mean it. I want to know. The tribunal process took almost a full year. Multiple sessions, multiple investigators, translators working simultaneously. I told them everything. Not because of any arrangement, but because I had decided in that cell that I was finished with concealment as a way of life. The truth was the only thing I had left that was worth anything, and it belonged to the 47 families, not to me. At one point, a Kurdish female investigator, I won't use her name, asked me privately during a break what had actually happened to me in that cell. Not for the record, just human to human. She had read the part of my statement describing the third night, and she had come back to it. She told me she had grown up in a Christian family, that her grandmother had been a believer. I told her what I've told you. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "My grandmother used to say that Jesus goes looking for the ones everyone else has already given up on. The further gone they are, the harder he looks." She stood up and returned to her desk. I sat with that sentence for many days. Some months into the process, a woman named Marta began visiting the facility as part of an international religious support program. She was Syrian Christian, from a village near Homs, probably in her mid-50s, with grey-streaked hair she always pinned back neatly, and a quality of listening with her whole body. When she sat across from you, she became completely still, and the attention was total. She brought Arabic New Testaments and sat with any detainee who wanted to talk. The first time I sat with Marta, I told her I didn't know what I was. I said I had had an experience, but I didn't know what category it belonged to, or what it required of me, or whether someone with my history was even in a position to speak the words that I could feel gathering somewhere inside me, but hadn't said yet. I was looking at my hands when I said this. My hands on the table between us. She waited until I had finished, and then she said, "Noor, do you believe Jesus is who he said he is?" I was quiet for a long moment, not because I was uncertain about the answer, which surprised me when I recognized that, because the answer was already there and had been since the morning after the light. I was quiet because saying it out loud made it real in a new way. Then I said, "I think I do." She said, "Then that's where you start. Everything else comes after." I had expected procedure. I had spent years inside systems built entirely on procedure, on the orderly processing of commitment and the verification of standing. I expected steps, conditions, a probationary period, a review board. She gave me none of that. She gave me a question and an answer, and that's where you start. Marta came back every week. She brought food sometimes. Small things, dates wrapped in paper, a piece of flatbread still faintly warm. She sat with me in the texts. We talked about the Psalms, which I had never read seriously before, which undid me repeatedly because they were so honest about grief and confusion and the sensation of crying out to God and hearing nothing back. We talked about what it means to be accountable in a way that doesn't destroy you, which is different from accountability as punishment. She never minimized what I had done. She never offered cheap grace that would let me feel clean without cost. She sat in the weight of it with me and pointed again and again to the one she said was stronger than any weight. There was a session where I came apart over a passage I hadn't expected. The story of Peter, the disciple who denied Jesus 3 times on the night of the arrest, 3 times directly asked, "Do you know this man?" And 3 times, no. I read that, and what broke me wasn't the denial itself. It was what came after the resurrection. Jesus finds Peter on a beach. There's a fire of burning coals. The text is specific about this, and it matters because it echoes the fire where Peter stood when he denied him. And Jesus doesn't prosecute him. He asks him 3 times, "Do you love me?" 1 question for every denial, not to shame him, to restore him, to give back piece by piece what fear had broken apart. I wept for a long time. Marta sat with me. When I had finished, she said, "He meets you where the wound is." Every time, I thought about the window of the hospital room my mother described, the light coming in a way she had never seen before, the name she gave me because of that light, and then the voice in the cell, my name, the one given to mark me with light before I had done a single thing to deserve it or disqualify myself. He walked straight to the wound. The wound was my name. I was transferred after the tribunal concluded to a different facility while the legal proceedings continued. The conditions were somewhat improved. There was a small courtyard I could access for an hour each day, a rectangle of cracked concrete with a single scraggly tree in one corner that had somehow produced a handful of green leaves despite everything working against it. I used to stand near it during my hour outside and put my hand on the bark and think about the pomegranate tree in my family's garden. I thought about my mother's hands on the fabric she sewed. I thought about the smell of bread and smoke in the kitchen the morning the war arrived. I thought about what she would make of who her daughter had become. Not the judge, not the jihadist, but this. A woman standing next to a courtyard tree, talking to Jesus quietly in her head, still carrying 47 names, still broken in ways she couldn't fully map yet. I wrote her a letter. I don't know if she received it. I don't know if she is still alive. I wrote it anyway because Marta told me that forgiveness, real forgiveness, the kind that costs something, begins not with the other person receiving it, but with you releasing what you have been holding. I had been holding my mother's grief at arm's length for years. I let it touch me when I wrote the letter. I told her I was sorry for leaving, not with the old justifications, just I chose wrong. I was wrong in the place where I was most certain I was right. I love you. Whether those words ever reached her, I don't know. I know they left me. Something shifted in the leaving. The legal proceedings resulted in a significant custodial sentence. I won't detail the specifics. This story is not about the legal framework, but about what was happening on the inside, while the external process moved forward. What I will say is that I did not appeal. consciously, deliberately, not because I was resigned or broken, but because I believed accountability was right. Because 47 families deserved the formal acknowledgement that human law can offer, even knowing the deeper accounting belongs elsewhere. Within the prison, I was placed in a general women's section, people with nothing to do with the conflict. Ordinary crimes, ordinary lives, gone sideways. My history became known quickly. Things always travel in closed environments. There were women who wouldn't sit near me. Looks and words I understood even across language barriers. I accepted that. I wasn't there to be accepted. I was there to become something different from what I had been. There was a small group of Christian women who gathered on Sunday mornings in a room that fit 8 people sitting on the floor with their knees nearly touching. A woman named Sana led it, in for financial crimes, a bookkeeper who had falsified records under duress from a corrupt employer. She was quick and bright-eyed and laughed with the ease of someone for whom laughter is a reflex rather than a decision, which struck me as remarkable given where we were. The first Sunday I stood in the doorway, not sure whether I belonged. Sana looked across the room at me and patted the floor next to her. Just that. Come sit here. I sat there every Sunday for the rest of my time in that facility. It was the most honest community I had ever been part of. Not because the people were without fault, we were convicted women in a prison, but because within that circle no one was performing anything. Everyone there had failed in some significant way and knew it, and everyone there was reaching toward the same thing with whatever broken hands they had. There's a specific kind of belonging that only exists in that combination. We read scripture aloud, taking turns, the voices different in rhythm and accent. We prayed out loud, which I had not done in any real sense since before everything fell apart. The first time I prayed aloud in that circle, my voice shook so badly I could barely complete a sentence. Sana put her hand on my back and kept it there until I was done. I don't have a word adequate to what that felt like. I know I didn't forget it. I know it was part of the slow reconstruction of something I had believed was permanently beyond rebuilding. I began to understand something in those Sunday mornings I had never understood in all my years inside the ideology, the difference between a system that demands your performance and a relationship that receives your reality. The Islamic State, like many rigidly ideological structures, required constant performance of certainty. Doubt was a diagnostic of weakness. You maintained the surface or you were suspect. Everything I had become was built on that performance. And Jesus, as I was coming to know him through those worn pages and those early morning circles, required the exact inverse. He kept walking toward the doubt. He kept stopping at the exhaustion. Come to me, all who are weary, not the strong, the weary. That inversion rearranged something at a structural level. There is a question I get asked whenever I tell any part of this story. Why do you think he came to you? Of all people, why that cell? Why that night? Why someone with that amount of blood on her hands? I used to deflect the question. Now I have an answer. I think he came to me because I was finally empty enough to hear him. 6 years of iron certainty had been stripped completely away. The ideology was rubble. The identity was rubble. The justifications were rubble. There was nothing left to protect, no wall standing, nothing to maintain. And into that total emptiness, something entered that I could not have produced myself, something I had not constructed or invited or reached toward. It arrived. I think that's what he does. He waits for the emptiness, not because he wants the destruction, but because a person full of their own certainty has no room. The vessel has to be empty to receive something it couldn't make. My certainty had been absolute. My emptiness, when it finally came, was absolute. And something met it. I think about the woman with the calloused hands, the one who looked at me through the whole hearing without looking away. I don't know her name. I don't know what happened to her family. I'm not going to suggest that anything that happened to me balances anything that happened to her. The mathematics of harm doesn't work that way. What I can tell you is that I carry her with me, not as punishment. Marta helped me understand the difference between penitential self-destruction and the honest bearing of responsibility. I carry her as a name, as a face, as the debt of attention I owe to the reality of what she was. I pray her name, I ask for mercy I know I haven't earned, and accept that the answer is not mine to determine. There are dark days. I want to be honest about that, because testimony that only shows the triumphant arc does a disservice to people who are struggling and wondering why their story doesn't feel triumphant yet. There are days when the weight presses down with a force that no amount of prayer seems to shift. Days when I look at my own hands and see only the function they served for 6 years. On those days, I go back to the beach, the fire of coals, the question asked 3 times. I go back to the man next to Jesus on the cross, a convicted criminal in his final minutes saying only, "Remember me," and being told, "Today." Not after review, not after sufficient time. Today. I hold that and I choose again to believe it. I was released after serving part of my sentence through a process I won't describe in detail. I am not free in the unrestricted sense. There are legal conditions monitoring a status that follows me. I'm not asking for sympathy about any of that. What I will tell you is this: I am alive, which I did not expect. I am outside a cell, which I did not expect. And I have a community of people who know exactly what I was and who have chosen to walk alongside what I am becoming, which I least expected of all. Marta is still present in my life. We speak when we can. She gives me practical work, things that involve other people, things where my capabilities are used in service rather than in judgment. She says service is what repentance looks like when it stops being an emotion and becomes a practice. I believe her. Belief, I've learned, is less about feeling convinced and more about choosing to act as if the thing is true until the truth becomes its own evidence. Every day I act as if grace is real. Every day it becomes more evidently real. I attend a church now, a small one that meets in a building with thick old walls that the cold finds its way through in winter. There's a woman in that congregation who lost someone in the conflict. She knows my history. We have sat next to each other. She has not moved away. I have no adequate description of what it took on her part to make that choice or what it means to me. I only know that grace is not a gentle thing. It is one of the most demanding things I have ever encountered because it refuses to let you stay where you are. It keeps asking you to stand up and become something you couldn't construct on your own. I don't know what the next years look like. I don't know if I will ever find my mother, whether she's alive, whether she would receive me. I don't know how many more difficult days there will be. What I know is what I have, a name spoken in the dark when everything else had been taken. A light in the corner of a concrete cell that the guards outside could not see. A voice that knew me before the ideology translated me into something else. And a community of broken people who meet in cold rooms on Sunday mornings and reach toward the same presence and remind each other that they are not alone in the reaching. I started this by telling you that when the bolt slid into place and the cell went dark, I felt that the darkness was deserved. I want to come back to that, because that feeling was not wrong exactly. I was right that consequences were deserved. What I was wrong about, completely catastrophically wrong about, was what I believed came after that. I thought deserved consequences meant the end. I thought that a person who had done what I had done was simply outside the boundary of anything real or living or true. I thought the dark was final. I had seen enough endings to believe that was how endings worked. The dark was not final. There was a name inside it, my name. The one my mother gave me on a summer afternoon in Deir ez-Zor when the light was coming through the hospital window in a way she had never seen. The name that means light, spoken by the one who made the light. in the darkest room I had ever been in, as if to say, this is where I've been waiting for you. You had to run out of everything else first, but this is where I've been. I am still Noor. I am learning slowly what that name means in this second life I didn't expect to have. And if you are somewhere right now in your own darkness, whatever shape it takes, whatever you've done or failed to do, whatever identity you've built that has become rubble, I need you to hear this. The voice that found me in that cell is not limited to that cell. It is not limited to the dramatic and the extreme. It goes looking for whoever needs finding. The further gone, the harder it looks. If this story meant something to you, if something opened while you listened, please subscribe to this channel. That's how these stories travel from one person to the next, from one dark room to another, from whoever watched this an hour ago to whoever needs to hear it tomorrow. That's the only reason I agreed to tell it, not for myself, for whoever is out there carrying something they believe puts them beyond reach. They need to know that nobody is beyond reach. I'm living evidence of that. And I will keep saying it as long as I have a voice to say it with.